If you think the shirt I'm wearing's pretty dope and you want to tell people even upon death you will rise from the grave just to continue getting through that massive pile of books on your shelf, you just need to go to danielbgreen.com or click the link down below and you too can look like a little goblin. But now, let's go ahead and get into The Hobbit.
Mr. Bilbo, where are you off to? Can't stop, I'm already late. Late for what? I'm going on an adventure.
Probably the most popular fantasy book I have failed to review on this channel. Yes, somehow, after 7, I think, plus years of being a booktuber, I haven't reviewed The Hobbit. But what could I really add to the conversation that hasn't already been said? It's the foundational book for modern day fantasy, only maybe outdone by its sequels, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which I agree with Tolkien, should have been published as one book. It still would be like the size of one Cosmere novel at that point, you know? But to conquer the issue of what could I possibly say about The Hobbit when reviewing it, today I've decided to storyboard and summarize the entire story for you. That is right, we are going to be going through beat by beat the tale of Bilbo Baggins. And I couldn't be more excited to jump on into it and show off my incredible artistic talent to y'all. This right here is clearly Van Gogh! But I do want to get into a couple of things before we actually start the story, though, in terms of, like, critiques, thoughts, input on the general reception of having freshly read The Hobbit. I actually started doing it because it's Kayla's favorite book, and I wanted to quote The Hobbit when I proposed to her, and I did, and it made us both happy. But then, you know, let's also make that content out of it.
All the more proof I have no soul.
What kind of struck me most upon this reread is how much Tolkien's prose do so much of the heavy lifting here, and I believe are a large part of why this story is so fondly remembered. Because there are several scenes, character traits, ideas put forth that you could criticize within The Hobbit, but Tolkien just packages them so prettily all the time. You end up kind of feeling like a jackass being like, well, aren't they kind of screwing over Bilbo here? Oh, you said it so nice. Okay. No, it's okay that they're doing this. Everything's fine.
It's intoxicating.
It's an absolutely sensational example of how the art of writing is such an integral part of actually crafting a good story, which might sound like duh, and I agree with you. But what enhanced Tolkien's reading of the story this time even more for me was this is the first time I've read The Hobbit through an audiobook format, and specifically I did the new Andy Serkis version. And I know there's going to be a lot of thoughts and opinions on there about what the best audiobook of The Hobbit is, because we've seen multiple of the best narrators of all time take a stab at it. But I just want to say that not only obviously did Andy Serkis bring an incredible amount to the character of Gollum, surprise, surprise, but in general, he struck a phenomenal balance of putting passion into the words without letting his read of it overtake the story. And if you want a better example of what I'm talking about, listen to Will Wheaton narrate any audiobook ever. He, by default, just puts his personality over the author's texts, and it drives me up the goddamn wall.
Cocked back his arm in a wind-up to drive the frankly rather substantial blade into my uncle's already cold and lifeless heart. In fairness.
Stop it. There are also narrators who do not nearly enough, and it ends up feeling like borderline AI passionless read-through. But here we have, I would say, the perfect balance for me.
Who are you? He said, thrusting the dagger out in front of him.
What is he, my precious?
Gave it a lot of energy, but it was always story forward. And it is probably going to be my go-to audiobook reading of The Hobbit, unless someone says like, no, you gotta do this one. I also want to take a moment to comment on the wonderful perspective The Hobbit is written in. In a time in fantasy where third-person limited or first-person have become so dominant, it's kind of nice to have a third-person omniscient story, and of course enhances the fairy tale aspect of The Hobbit as well. But on top of that, The Hobbit in how it's told is so radically different from Lord of the Rings, let alone the Silmarillion. And the reason for that is, of course, the entire mythos of the Lord of the Rings had not been conceived yet, and Tolkien didn't know that this was going to be like the discovered texts. And so what you get is a story that's clearly written from a human perspective and feels like a father telling their child just this amazing story of Mr. Bilbo Baggins. It's this nice natural evolution into the Lord of the Rings, which of course feels far different. And then finally you get the most just historical text feeling thing Lord of the Rings ever put out, the Silmarillion. The story is also clearly told from a human's perspective, despite what I'm about to mention, how long it takes us to get to the humans. And it adds this natural curiosity to what's going on, beyond that if it was actually written as if it was Bilbo's journey of there and back again that we see him writing. This is obviously not written from that perspective. And you can easily justify this disconnect by just saying that yes, this is the influence of Tolkien or whatever human it is translating this text, adding in their own asides, and I'm sure that's like the canonical explanation. But the reality is it's just how the series evolved. Tolkien's understanding of what Middle-earth could be and his evolving perspective of it is reflected in these stories. And I just find that to be another angle that makes experiencing this story as a reread possibly even better than a first read through. And then one final clarification before we get into everything that can like be easily woven into the story itself in terms of commentary. This is the version that had the revised updated scene between Bilbo and Gollum to fix the canon of Lord of the Rings. For those of you who don't know, there are actually revisions to The Hobbit that were done because Tolkien needed the story to actually justify his sequels with how the ring is acquired rather than the original riddle battle that happens. So we'll get there as well. Have you possibly forgotten some important key scenes from The Hobbit? Will I accidentally cast a fireball waving this around? Let's start the story. There and back again begins there at Bilbo Baggins' house. And I falsely remembered us spending quite a bit of time in the Shire. That is absolutely not the case. The story picks up with essentially Gandalf arriving at Bilbo's house and Bilbo being like, wow, this guy's paying a lot of attention to me, and Gandalf assumedly just kind of goes like, you're gonna be my burglar. Like internally he just finds this one hobbit, it's like, that's the guy. And then they refer to Bilbo as a burglar henceforth forever after, which raises the question, was he like a career Ocean's 11 style criminal before the adventures of the Hobbit? Like what was Bilbo getting up to that Gandalf so confidently was like, you're a He was not. We just know he's a well-off hobbit. Although we don't really know what his job is before this. At least I don't think we're told. Maybe he was a career criminal and Gandalf just knew about it. That's not ruled out technically. But Bilbo, in the tradition of always watch your words around wizards, technically extends an invitation for Gandalf to come back for tea. And Gandalf, being a wizard, knows that that means he can come back and do his thing, where he proceeds to ruin Bilbo Baggins' life.
Put that back. Put that back. Not the jam, please. Excuse me. Excuse me. A tad excessive.
Yes, the story of The Hobbit is Gandalf essentially just ruining Bilbo's current situation in the world and outlook on things. By the end of it, Bilbo is kind of Stockholm Syndrome into being like, this is all good, but in reality, I don't know how much I agree with that. We'll get into it.
The glasses and crack the plates. That's what Bilbo Baggins hates.
But this takes us to the uber iconic scene where we have the entire party of dwarves comedically arrive into the Shire and go to Bilbo's house. And it is genuinely funny and structured well as a joke how this party continues to arrive and flood on into this little hobbit dwelling. And there's also a lot of really smart implied characterization going on behind the scenes. I'm not going to try and maintain that like every dwarf is distinguishable in the narrative. That is absolutely not the case. Essentially just Thorin and Balin become the ones that have like severe standout character. But when it comes to Gandalf and Bilbo, there's this calculated softness to everything Gandalf does that comes through oh so well. Like he happens to just arrive with the last of the dwarves. And yeah, Bilbo can't really say no at this point because of how much the party is just taken over. An actual breaking in it. They're the burglars. They even eat his food and like sleep there and everything. Like they basically rob Bilbo.
Oh my god.
I am never going to financially recover from this.
Maybe that's why Bilbo really ended up agreeing going on the journey. They financially ruined him. But just to say, I officially did do my job here, I'm now going to list off the name of every dwarf in the party. We have Thorin Oakenshield, Fili, Kili, Oin, Gloin, Balin, Dwalin, Ori, Dori, Nori, Beefer, Bofer, Bomber, and of course Bilbo Baggins and Gandalf. The only ones that really remain important to the wider story are Thorin and I think Balin, because he ends up as a Lord of Moria, if I'm not mistaken. But that does not happen in this book. There's some wonderful songs to be had, and they are written oh so spectacularly. I'm not going to try and claim that Tolkien was some great musician, because there's not like notes happening or anything, but in terms of the poetic lyricism going on, pitch perfect match the tone, managed to be funny, yet add whimsy and a mystique at times to the grander vision of the world. Certainly most of the epic world building for Middle-earth happened in Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, but for how brief and light The Hobbit is as a read, an impressive amount is still done here, just in the northern half of Middle-earth. Bilbo has a pretty different from what you see in the movie, I'm gonna go on an adventure moment, but does end up, through Gandalf's psychological manipulation, I believe, agreeing to abandon his home and go on a journey with all of these little dwarves. And it kind of takes a while for us to meet any human within The Hobbit. This surprised me. Like there's like casual mentions of humans, of course, and like maybe a guy in the background. But until we end up pretty much down here at the bottom of the board, there is not a substantial human character, which I think is a really great decision and adds to the alien worldness of The Hobbit in a really effective way. You are forced as a reader to start viewing hobbits, dwarves, elves, and even trolls and goblins to an extent in a human-esque way, whereas if first we were following humans, the foreign influence would feel like The Hobbit. But no, by the time we get to humans, they are almost the one that feel out of place in the text. I remember this happening way later on, but we go from Bilbo's Hobbit hole to fairly quickly at the, it's going to just sound redundant to say throughout this video, but I'm going to say it, iconic troll scene.
Look, Frodo. It's Mr. Bilbo's trolls.
Where Gandalf, after the entire party of dwarves and Bilbo end up getting themselves tied up and thrown into sacks, which, real poor showing, guys. You seem like some weak sauce. He's able to stall until the sun comes up and turns these guys into stone. Yes, my artistic rendition of trolls is without fault. Enjoy. And I love that in the age-old tradition of fantasy storytelling, they loot these motherfuckers. They find where they've buried all their stuff, bury it again to find on their return journey, and are like, yeah, we're gonna pick up these dead trolls' loot after we're all done here. And they do. Okay, maybe I was wrong. Bilbo is at least partaking in criminal activities as we go deeper on. Not long after this, though, we meet the friendliest elves of the entire journey when our party makes a stop in Rivendell. And Rivendell, at least for Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, is a touchstone of importance before you go off on your journey. The repetition of it being in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings is so narratively justified, I can't exactly be like, for sure, Tolkien just did this so that we have this familiar grounds, but it does feel deliberate in a sense that this leg of the journey for both starts very similarly, and it's not until after the set out from Rivendell that I feel like the tone of the two stories really begins to hit the reader. Don't get me wrong, Lord of the Rings from Go feels a lot less like a children's book, but The Hobbit after Rivendell still continues to feel like a fun party and an adventure, where the weight of the ring and its possible impact on the world are really understood after we get to Rivendell and Lord of the Rings, and the weight of the Fellowship entirely different than just our fun little vagabond group of dwarves. And in terms of Rivendell being a touchstone, it's this refuge from the first exposure and the dangers of the world in both journeys. It's kind of interesting how, well, yes, Bilbo has the trolls and some just general spookiness of being out and about. Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin have Bree and the riders coming after them before, again, seeking refuge in Rivendell. I think it's a neat little parallel. From Rivendell, they get supplied up, have a wonderful time with the elves before heading to the Misty Mountains. And this is where our party gets separated because goblins.
Goblins cough and goblins beat, goblins laugh and goblins
And the goblins are, okay, so I'm going to bring up the Hobbit movies as little as I can here. But I've seen people say, like, the goblins don't play nearly the same role that they do in the Hobbit trilogy. That's true. But the goblins are still, like, a central protagonist that has, I would say, just as much, if not more weight than Smaug by the end. I mean, at least they are directly confronted by our party, where Smaug is not, because there was just no way for our party to handle Smaug. So goblins, in my read of The Hobbit at least, feel like a more central antagonist, but by like threat weight, absolutely Smaug outweighs them, because even early on they start talking about the dragon in the mountain, and there's this constant like, we'll deal with it when we get there. And that's a core flaw to the entire dwarven philosophy of this journey, but we're going to get in that way later on, how much these guys essentially had a plan of like,
Phase 1, find a dragon. Phase 2, Phase 3, profit.
but the goblins end up successfully separating the party. And this is where, again, early on, Bilbo has probably the most important moment for the lore of Lord of the Rings in all of The Hobbit. And that is his confrontation with Gollum, where, again, super iconic scene, they have a riddle off. And I cannot stress enough how much the revised version is certainly the better version of the scene for the whole of Middle-earth. I actually also think it does a good job of giving Bilbo a bit more characterization, because he wins through just straight up bullshit. Like, I don't want to be on the side of Gollum, who's threatening to eat our little hobbit friend, but within these mountains, in this cave, Bilbo is breaking and entering. I'm now eating my words big time. This guy is violating someone else's home. Finds a random golden ring, is just like, mine. Boop, puts it in his pocket. And then once he finds the owner of the ring, doesn't tell him he took his jewelry, and has a riddle off where he uses the ring as an answer to then beat the game, because there's no way Gollum would have known he stole from him, because Gollum believed maybe this hobbit was a nice guy. How Gollum is treated terribly here.
You are thieving little
But it comes down to a final riddle where Bilbo does not ask a riddle, and instead asks the impossible to answer question for Gollum, what's in my pocket?
See, now that's some bull.
And it's the ring. And Gollum's like, nothing? I don't know. And Bilbo's like, you're wrong. I get to leave after 3 wrong answers. And then Gollum's like, wait a minute. That's not fair. And later on is like, what's in your pocket, after he finds out his ring is missing. Don't get me wrong. Gollum loses like any moral high ground when he tries to eat Bilbo. But 2 rights don't make a wrong, Bilbo. That's why he keeps calling thieving hobbitses. That's all tied together, baby. And then Bilbo has to escape using the ring to get past a lot of the goblins that are trying to block his way out. And then he meets up with the rest of the crew, who are like amazed that he was able to get out of the situation. But Bilbo's just slipping into the Wraithy realm. And yeah, it's not as impressive as he makes it out to be. Bilbo's character is kind of a shady dude, because they're like, how'd you do it? And he's like, I'm just that sneaky, boys. You have a ring of invisibility. And in survival situations, it's very important that the entire party knows the tools at everyone's disposal. But no, Bilbo's just like, keeping that to me. We don't have too much time to deal with that, though, because as you can see by the warg face here, which I tried to very distinctly make a wolf kind of face, not a dragon one, so you didn't think we were already at Smaug on the board here. But the wargs and the goblins are now confronted by the dwarves, and they actually managed to kill like an important goblin, which I think is like where the most goblin divergence in the movies does happen, because like the goblins don't continue to bring up like a super important goblin. There's not one mentioned ever again. They just come by later for the Battle of the Five Armies. And the more I think about this, the more I am bugged by them bringing in that like white goblin. The goblins just kind of remaining this mass of evil on their tail throughout the books is more effective than putting like an individual face on it, like the trilogy tried to do for some reason. It feels like they didn't have faith that we as an audience could feel a threat from just like an entire dark army. Not really sure about that. But yes, at this scene, they're like cornered by a vengeful army who have like big wolves and goblins and all this stuff, and they climb trees to try to get away, and the goblins are like lighting fires and poking up at them like, I got to tell you. And Gandalf is about to yeet himself into the goblins to like hopefully kill a bunch and likely die in the process. It even says like he would have died. You're like an angel. What? It feels like you should kick their ass. But again, The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings lore does not exactly line up in my opinion. I'm not trying to say Gandalf couldn't be killed by goblins, but in my read of his character, felt like he should be able to handle this situation.
Flame of Udun!
But they are saved by the eagles, who have noticed all the commotion of the goblins, and the fucking eagles, they hate the goblins. It is on sight with the eagles and the goblins. It specifically said like, yeah, the eagles, mighty, majestic, wonderful beasts who are like above it all in Middle-earth. But if they see one of those dirty, disgusting fucking goblins,
What the? See, that's the type of... I'm gonna kick your ass.
they will pull over and do whatever to ruin their day. So they end up saving the party. The goblins are all mad, but the eagles save them, take them way further on in their quest, and drop them far closer to the Lonely Mountain, which does a little bit feel kind of like Tolkien was like, man, this is a long map I made, and these guys need to get way closer. They get on an eagle. It doesn't come across like that, because as I said, he writes it so beautifully, and you're like flying through Middle-earth, learning about the lore of the eagles, like, whee! But from a writing standpoint, Tolkien looked at that map and went, and they go that far on an eagle's back, because I'm tired. But this is where they get dropped on like the outskirts of Mirkwood, and Gandalf just is like, I got a friend in the neighborhood. Before I leave you all, I want to hang out with my good buddy Bjorn, so let's go hang out with Bjorn. And Bjorn is quite possibly actually the scariest entity in The Hobbit. I know Smaug is here, but Bjorn is a man-bear Bjorn, and his whole presence on the page feels so carefully handled by frickin' Gandalf that by affiliation, you're like, oh, Bjorn, big scary dude. Hence why I drew him as big scary dude. And Gandalf gets like all of the dwarves to stay behind but Bilbo, and is like, dudes, slowly approach after I say there are more of us. Because if we all go at once, Bjorn is going to man-bear our ass. And so through telling Bjorn the story of how they've gotten there so far, Gandalf keeps subtly upping the number of people in their party, and Bjorn keeps being like, what do you mean, like 5 ponies? You guys don't have, there's only 2 of you. Do you have extra ponies? And then Gandalf's like, oh, we actually have a couple more dwarves. Come on, guys. And it's like, again, Gandalf, manipulative, overriding people's free will and actual desires individual. He's not a bad guy, but in modern society, he'd be your manipulative neighbor that everyone's like, watch out for him. He's not going to call the city to get your car towed, but something bad will happen to your car if it's parked in front of his house. And he'll be standing in the porch like, wild that that branch fell there. But after Gandalf has a fun party, hangout, chill time after all this stress with his good buddy Bjorn, he then decides right before the journey gets to its most dangerous, he's like, I'm out.
I gotta go.
I gotta go do other wizard stuff. To which all the dwarves and Bilbo were like, dude, you are an angel, so powerful, good friend, and like why we are alive due to multiple things that have happened here. What? You're just gonna let us go through Mirkwood on our own into the land of elves who are not friendly to us? Now's the time you're gonna dip? Yes. And so Gandalf pieces out. And this is where it really started to strike me how action-packed The Hobbit is. Like, don't get me wrong, the movies were substantially less feeling so because of how much they had to draw things out to hit 3 movies. There's a good movie in there if you edited it down and took out the romance. But in terms of the actual reading experience, this is still wonderful for younger readers, even the TikToked out, Ritalin drinking, red dye consuming youngest generation, because as a story, this is trolls, party, goblins, rap battle, wolves flying with an eagle, man-bear Bjorn in like so fast. This is happening so goddamn quickly. But this takes us to the part of the story where Bilbo gets to truly be his best burglar self, because they end up going into Mirkwood, and the dwarves not having a good time of it. Because of the goblins and having to only kind of be able to restock a little with Bjorn, they end up losing like most of their supplies, if I'm remembering correctly. And they're rapidly out of food, starving, unwashed, walking through elven woods, truly looking like vagabonds. But the problem is they end up seeing some lights in the distance that are like, oh, these are elves. And they approach, but the elves, once these vagabond, dirty, starving dwarves stumble into their light, are like, ew, and turn off the lights on them, disappear, go set up their party somewhere else, continue to feast, and then the homeless dwarves show up again, and the elves once again are like, ew. And this happens on repeat, and spiders come in at some point. And Bilbo takes out the sword he's been given in Rivendell, and he's like, this is Sting. Look how it's f***ing stinging this spider. I'm killing. Sleep. He does murder a spider and sleep next to its body. Pretty hardcore, Bilbo. But we do get like Sting cemented as Sting through that. And finally, all of the dwarves and Thorin are taken prisoner by the elves. And so is not Bilbo. That's right, because magic ring. He is actually able to slip into the city within the forest that the dwarves are being held in because he puts on his ring. And for like weeks or possibly months, he is straight up just like invisible and just completely living within the elven society, stealing food and wine. This dude's getting a little roasty toasty while he's in the survival situation, just putting that out there. Well, the dwarves just sit in prison, and I know he took a long time to like slowly plan the perfect heist to get the dwarves out. Understandable, and I think he did a good job. I just also think it's worth pointing out that while he's doing this, he's drinking a substantial amount of wine. You have to just assume Sauron is in a vastly different position right now, because when Frodo puts on the ring, it's like and Sauron and like dark things. But all the way back in this time, Bilbo is able to casually spend weeks in a condition that in the Lord of the Rings trilogy appears like this. So these are just vastly different experiences, and Frodo got the shorter end of the stick, for sure. Though I do want to say here, definitively now, Bilbo, way better character than Frodo. Frodo, he's fine. Bilbo is like a flawed, kind of dangerous, wants to be left alone, but is certainly willing to stab someone, badass. And Frodo, on the other hand, does not have that badass edge, in my opinion. But yes, Bilbo figures out that while the elves are feasting, he will be able to get the dwarves out of prison, put them into barrels that are like empty from wine, not that he drank them all themselves, like this is a part of the feast.
Look, whatever you got going on, fill me in. 'Cause I'm in the dark here. Chaparral Associates got the contract to retrofit this place in '99. $4 million contract. Head partner couldn't crack it.
But these barrels are essentially just sent downriver for other elves to like use to bring to people. And so yeah, the dwarves are put in these casks, shipped down a river to other elves who bind the casks together. And Bilbo again steals a pie and some booze while this is going on, does not pull the dwarves from the barrels, has a feast, sleeps, wakes up just in time while they're shipping all of his friends inside barrels downriver, and then like jumps on the side of it invisible with his ring, and he's like, oh, man, I have it rough right now. They're in barrels! Somehow though, once they get all the way down to Lake Town, all the dwarves are still okay. No one's drowned or run out of oxygen. They're in terrible shape, which credit to Tolkien for including that. And Bilbo has a cold at this point, which for some reason just reminded me that Tolkien is a veteran, and sickness at that time on the front line very often. So I just feel like somehow that's part of the reason why Tolkien put Bilbo getting a cold in there. I have no evidence for that. Moving on. And once they're at Lake Town, Bilbo has an opportunity to actually break everybody out. And then there's kind of this epic scene where the dwarves, in their horrid state, like they've been starved, kept prisoner, fed, but then shoved into barrels and shipped down a river over like multiple days. And so they're like, oh God, but they like straightening their back, end up in like the main area where the governor and everything is of Lake Town. And they're like, yeah, I'm the guy who's supposed to come back and reclaim the mountain. And all of the villagers are like, that's Thorin! Oh, And even though, like, the person in charge, he's not a king, maybe he is, I don't remember, it's like this bad dude who only cares about, like, money, is like, we don't want to support them. The town gets so hype, just completely overwhelms him. And instead, the dwarves get, like, fed, equipped, and the people in Lake Town are like, off you go, you badass heroes. We think you are so awesome. Kick that dragon ass. Have a good one. Remember that. It's coming back into play.
You will regret this for as long as you live.
There's also, before we move on to the next part here, a note made throughout all of this that the Mirkwood and even the elves living among it, just the world itself is becoming more wild as culture, species, everything else becomes more separated from it. It's not that they aren't destroying forests and stuff within The Hobbit. That's kind of implied. It's just that as we view ourselves as conquering nature, there's kind of this theme throughout The Hobbit where we become disconnected from it. You do not understand the world by being above it. You understand the world by being a part of it. And there's somehow that message kind of woven in, at least my reading of The Hobbit, so subtly. I just adore it. But this is going to take us to the second half of the story. And I did strategically split it there because if you were going to do a Hobbit film, I think it could be 2, not 3 movies. 2 would have been acceptable, and ending it there would have been badass and really had like a lot of momentum and hype for the next book as the party sets off to fight a dragon. But that's just my thought anyway. And then the next movie would start with all of our people climbing on over a mountain trying to find a way in because there's a big ass door that no one has a key to. And eventually Bilbo's like, oh, right, I saw a map before. There's a secret entrance. And they eventually find a secret entrance. Not the smoothest way to handle a situation narratively, but again, Tolkien writes it so well with such good characterization and callbacks that you're just kind of like, yeah, neat. But here we have them eventually find their way in, and this is where the danger of Bilbo just being the burglar really comes in the forefront, because several different times throughout this story, like when they were seeing the lights in Mirkwood, they would send Bilbo closer and be like, you're the short little weird go see it. And now it's like really emphasized because he is the only one sent through the secret passage. He puts on his ring and he sneaks on up and he sees an amazing description of a dragon. Probably one of my favorite descriptions of a dragon in all of literature is how Bilbo sees Smaug on his unbelievable pile of gold. To the point where Bilbo, who's not been super motivated by riches necessarily, like don't get me wrong, my dude likes having his comfy chair and a good pint of wine. Seems like the amount he drinks. But it does not seem like he's super money motivated. But even he looks at this pile of gold and is like, damn, oh, this is some wealth, which sets up a conflict later on. But he then comes out with a cup to prove he was able to get to the treasure, and everyone's like, yay. But then there's this kind of conflict, because everyone's like, yay, you got him. But at the same time, dude, how are we going to actually get...
Phase 1, find a dragon. Phase 2, Phase 3, profit.
The treasure, like, out of... Are we going to fight this Are we fighting the and then they hear within like some noise and they're like, this could be bad. And I'm drawing a small blank on hold up one second. Okay, it's not in my notes, but somehow Bilbo ends up going in again. And it turns out that Smaug, who was sleeping his first time in, did end up smelling him. He was like, something's been in here. And he does notice, despite how massive his treasure pile is, this one cup being gone, which is probably tied into Tolkien's just general view of greedy people being unable to part with even the smallest bit of wealth, which we see time and again throughout Middle-earth stories. The rich suck, which... There's comments that could be made about Amazon currently being adapting stuff and how the Tolkien estate sold the rights, but we're not going to do that. We're going to keep on with the story of The Hobbit. And at this point, Bilbo is like, I know I need to do whatever to possibly survive. And apparently, the one way to survive a dragon in Middle-earth is to smooth talk the hell out of it. So the dragon can't see Bilbo, but is like, I know you're around here. Where are you? And Bilbo's defense is to be like, Damn, you a fine dragon. Oh my god, look how good your armor is. He even gets Smaug to roll over and show him his belly. I shit you not.
Oh, what a good boy. What a good boy.
And this exposes a critical weak point in Smaug's armor that is somehow then communicated to talking birds that are relevant to the story that I'm going to note here now because they'll come up later. But in his last moment, Bilbo decides to insult Smaug, which he should not have done, and he's trying to creep towards the exit, and Smaug figures it out, and Bilbo leaps out of the mountain right when Smaug hurls a fireball at him. And Bilbo ends up pretty hurt. He's severely singed, doesn't grow hair on his feet for many years, is noted. Odd detail. And at this point, Smaug decides that there has to be the people down in Lake Town responsible for this. So he's going to go attack it because screw those people. And so they see Smaug just leave off from the mountain. And Smaug actually... Oh, I remember now!
Oh my god, I remember now!
So Bilbo goes in, steals the cup. Smaug wakes up one time, comes out, and chases and eats their ponies, leaving the dwarves kind of stranded on the mountain. And they then, after a period of time, are like, Bilbo, go back in. And that's when he does his invisibility thing, and Smaug is back down there by this time. After Smaug comes out a second time, he's like, you had to have help from the Lake Town people, and I'm going to go attack them.
You'll regret this for as long as you live.
And that is when Smaug goes off to attack Lake Town, essentially leaving his treasure unguarded. Bam! I read it last week, and I still remember.
That's not impressive, but adequate.
And I drew this really small because the book kind of treats it small. It's beautifully written how Smaug attacks the town, and there is a Bard the bowman, who sees Smaug attacking and takes up his bow. And because those birds tell him about the weakness Bilbo found, yeah, that happens. He knows about the weak spot, makes a lottery shot, and kills Smaug, who then falls into Lake Town and destroys almost all of it. And a lot of people die. This is not a happy time. It's noted, I think, a third of the people of Lake Town die here. So, bad day.
You know how many people died here? Because you're a simple dwarf. Bullshit.
But I draw it small because it does not even happen with our party. Because meanwhile, they're not rushing back to Lake Town to try and help or anything. They decide to go on in, and they start exploring the treasure pile while this is happening. Hence why I drew it on a little picture up here. And the birds eventually tell them hey, someone shot and killed Smaug, and every airborne creature's talking about it. Big news for the avian community, which I get it. Smaug is probably the biggest avian, so every avian around is like, did you hear? But while the dwarves are learning of Smaug's defeat, Bilbo finds the Arkenstone, the most beautiful gem in the world. Kind of a proto-ring with how it's treated here. I think a lot of people probably made that commentary because it kind of becomes this obsessive focus for Thorin. You can see a lot of ideas, early development here in The Hobbit. But Bilbo decides that the Arkenstone will be his share of the treasure he's been promised, just this stone, and he pockets it, and Thorin keeps looking for it, so division in the party. But this is where Thorin becomes a bad guy, because if you've seen the movie or read the book, you know what happens here. He kind of becomes consumed by the greed with his treasure pile that is now kind of his in the mountain as he has reclaimed his ancestral lands. And very understandably, I'm on the side of the humans, believe it or not here. The humans show up and are like, hey, you're the reason Smaug attacked us, destroyed our home, give us a share of the treasure. And Thorin's like, no. Dude, you have infinite wealth and you're willing to separate with none of it, tying back to the cup. Now Thorin is acting in a similar way. Also, the elves, who thought the dwarves had died in the process, show up, also wanting a claim of the treasure because their ancestors, they feel, are owed stuff by the dwarves. That's debatable. And also there is a reinforcement army of dwarves from Dane, the dwarf shows up. He's a relative of Thorin. He's on his brother's side. And there's this massive standoff going on where they're like, pay us. And they end up shooting arrows back and forth at each other. It gets pretty violent. Thorin, not likable at all in this time. But most importantly, at this stage, Gandalf also returns and is like, Thorin, you're being a bastard. And you'll notice Bilbo is sneaking off here because Bilbo takes the Arkenstone and just sells out his party entirely. He tricks one of them to let him take watch duty, abandons watch duty, and then goes down and hands the Arkenstone to the elves and men and is like, hey, take my cut, it's whatever, I just don't want a battle to happen or bloodshed. And they're like, cool. And the next day, they show Thorin, like, we have your Arkenstone, and Thorin's like, fine, I will pay you some amount of this money. But just when you feel like Bilbo may have saved the day by stabbing everyone in the back, the goblins come back into play, and a massive horde of goblins attacks all of the armies, and there is a fight! And even Man-Bear Bjorn shows back up. We have Bilbo being knocked unconscious with the ring on, so he's just invisible, and there is just so much blood and action going on. But what finally saves the day is, yes, the eagles arrive, I guess the Fifth Army here, and they turn the tide of the battle by just annihilating the goblins' like superior position on one point. And I love that even in these poetic writings, where it's more about the feel of the battle going on at times and the momentum, Tolkien still manages to let you know strategically like what's happening and like how people are maneuvering around each other. No one writes a battle like Tolkien, even in The Hobbit, which is a children's book. Well done, Tolks. This actual conflict that happens during all of this, I kind of didn't mention, where Bilbo's told, like, how do you think you're going to get your treasure home? Like, these dwarves are screwing you over. They're not going to let you take a bunch of treasure, and you'd be robbed on the way home. And Bilbo's kind of like, good point. And he ends up having like his own doubts here at times. Like, there's actually a lot of distrust of the party woven in. And so his betrayal, it is kind of a betrayal. It does make sense. And at the same time, you could just take the Arkenstone and successfully go home with that. But he does end up making the best call, thinking he might not get any of the cut of the treasure. He's still willing to give up the one thing that could be his cut of the treasure. And it really just solidifies that, well, he is a burgle boy, and he definitely is willing to hack and slash some people. Bilbo makes the right call and makes a selfless act, something that could have been a resolution. It wouldn't have been anyway with the goblins showing up, and Gandalf gives him mad props as a result. And Sauron's eye, I assume, is not watching him during all of this, but there is a case to be made that maybe Sauron could see all of this, and every time Bilbo's wearing the ring, he's just like, I don't have my power yet to affect this at all, but what a damn interesting story unfolding. But the sad part is Thorin dies. He is mortally wounded during this battle, and we see that Dane, who arrived with the reinforcements, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, becomes the new Lord of the Mountain, assuming his relative's role. But Thorin's final words are of regret for his greed, and him and Bilbo and Gandalf all make up, and it's kind of nice. But because of Thorin's passing, of course, the treasure is agreed to be split among those who have a proper claim, and peace is had. Nothing unites fantasy races like butchering goblins. I'm a little offended. But yes, Bilbo is actually given not the Arkenstone. That is buried with Thorin in a beautiful moment to be like, yes, that was the most important to him, but it also clearly has like a corrupting influence. Let's just lay it with his body. No one will disturb it, and no one does. Nice. And so he gets his cut. That was the thing that would have been Bilbo's cut if he made the wrong call. And then Bilbo gets just laid up with a bunch of money, gets to keep his magic ring, and then heads off with Man-Bear Bjorn, Gandalf, and some ponies who are actually carrying the treasure. And then on their way back, you best believe it, they loot the troll stuff they had, even though it's probably a fraction of the wealth they had from the treasure they were given from the mountain. Doesn't matter. We gotta make as much money as possible, baby! And I just want to note that Gandalf is around this ring this whole time, does not notice or care. Gandalf is impressive in The Hobbit, underperforms. This dude, in hindsight, like his scorecard for accomplishments, especially with his just leaving for a while, not an S-tier actor. I would say B, especially with how much damage he could have prevented in the future if he's paid a little bit closer to the burglar he brought along on the treasure hunt. Just a couple quick closing notes here. The Battle of the Five Armies, I feel like, has been somewhat tainted for people since the movies. It's definitely one of Tolkien's best battles in how it's written. I really like it. It's certainly not as epic as Pelennor Fields or something like that, but for the Battle of the Five Armies of The Hobbit, it goes above and beyond what I think would normally be expected. It's not just a couple of paragraphs, and it feels substantial. Also on top of that, Lake Town changes up its leadership so that the nice bard warrior can be in charge and not the greedy, horrible guy who like made all of the philosophy of the town be about profit. So there's a lot more of Tolkien's ideology in there as well. And then finally, it's fine that Gandalf's necromancer plotline is like just him leaving, and we hear about the necromancer at one point. But I would have liked to certainly see more of it. So I get why it was added more to in the movies. But I would have just done it differently than they did. It is noted that we have kind of a nice long end to this action-filled journey that is very not action-filled, and structurally it feels wonderful. There has been a remarkable amount of action crammed into a fairly short book, as you can see, and the last good chunk is just Bilbo, it feels like, and the reader finally being able to just appreciate the beauty of the world that Tolkien has made for us so far. And so they even stop in Rivendell and have like a long time just partying and hanging out, and Bilbo gets to kind of have his like, I'm a big deal.
Do you know who I am?
No, I can't say that I do.
I don't know how to put this, but I'm kind of a big deal.
And so that's a nice little bonding and reflective of the eventual friendships that were made with the other elves and men. It's just everything is in peace. But when they finally get home, Bilbo finds out, because he's been gone for like a year now, he's presumed dead. And all of his stuff is being sold off by his family in probably the most human moment for the hobbits in the whole story. Yeah, just let's make money on this dead guy. And he has to spend years in litigation, it's noted, fighting for all of his stuff back, but he does get it. And then it's specifically noted that his relationships are never the same again in the Shire. He is a social outcast, and the only reason people are showing up to his party in Lord of the Rings is because the hobbits like to party. So yes, Gandalf ruined Bilbo's life, to the point where many of his closest hobbit relatives refused to believe even after he returned that he truly was Bilbo Baggins. I do think that Bilbo's life might be better and more interesting after in some ways, but the life he had lays in ruin. But he's not mad because he has better friends now that are elves, dwarves, and Gandalf. And it's kind of weird that one of the last messages of The Hobbit is like, yeah, he never was able to make up with his previous friends that he didn't like that much, but it's fine because he has better, cooler friends now. Final cell phone insert, I swear to God, but there's also an additional parallel here where in both Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, there is an extended falling action after the climax. There's this longer period in devotion from Tolkien to the and back again to the segment of the story, which, especially with how action-packed The Hobbit was, it feels absolutely necessary, because a lot of the most incredible events in our life go by, no matter how much it is, so quickly. And then the even just airport ride home, which can be a fraction of the time, can feel so much longer. And I can't even imagine what the equivalent is like of that for someone like Tolkien, who went off to war, which of course I'm sure felt like many lifetimes and a blink of an eye. And so even in his children's tale, he is putting that very realistic structure into the story, and in both of his stories. But no, Bilbo is fantastic. One of my favorite characters in all of Middle-earth after rereading The Hobbit again. He's got so much agency. He overcomes fear. He's so intelligent. I mean, Tolkien notably wanted Bilbo to not be a traditional Beowulf-type protagonist for fantasy, and instead have him be one who relied on his wits and his, natural shortness, sneakiness, things along those lines, and that comes across still to this day as one of the strongest parts of The Hobbit as a story. Gandalf also, I made jokes, but is so mysterious and having this aura around him that has gone on to pretty much influence every major magical figure we've gotten in fantasy for decades, over a century now, and that is just so blisteringly well set up, obviously improved on in Lord of the Rings, but established here. And yes, you can say so many of the dwarves kind of just blend together, but there is bits of characterization given to each one where if you are a huge mega Hobbit fan, you can begin to separate them and tell them apart. Not to the extent of the Fellowship. Obviously, there are three main characters to this Fellowship in particular, whereas the Fellowship in Lord of the Rings is much more evenly spread in terms of narrative light. But it's not horrible here. And I would say for the story was being told is the right call. But what are my thoughts on The Hobbit after reading it this time? it's still a perfect 10. It has this unbelievably powerful fairy tale quality to it, while absolutely being epic fantasy. There is this true evolution from story in this vein before it and after it. Yes, there were things like it, but Tolkien's ability to realize a world has been attempted so many times since this book was released. But truly, while others have been able to build more deep worlds, more nuanced worlds, no one is able to set up and present a world to the reader as poetically, beautifully, and richly as Tolkien did here. And even improved on in The Lord of the Rings. On a technical level, Tolkien is untouched as a author, in my opinion, for fantasy. And I'm giving The Hobbit a perfect 10 out of 10. I mean, you can say you prefer The Lord of the Rings, but looking back at this, yeah, there's some narrative conveniences, but it's doing exactly what it wants to. And on everything it wants to deliver, it manages to land a haymaker. 10 out of 10, no question, and one of the best books I have ever read. Like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. And tell me, who's your favorite dwarf in the entire Hobbit adventure? Mine is going to be Thorin. I mean, I kind of like his whole greed thing is well done. And if you want to get this shirt, it's available in the links down below. Be a lifelong reader. Thank you to today's sponsor. And like and subscribe. All that fun stuff, y'all. Have a good one. Peace.